That's what I'm doing. All right, we'll give one more minute and then we will get started. Okay, welcome on everyone. We're going to get started here. This is our second in a series of three weeks discussing various issues relating to preparing food on Shabbos, specifically around heating and warming food. Certainly everyone is welcome, encouraged to put their cameras on so we can see your beautiful faces, but no pressure if you're busy with something else and you don't want to. So I'm going to share my screen here and share what we covered last week. And I shared last week that part of what I hope will accomplish is that people will see that the laws that we have, the customs, the practices that we have around preparing food on Shabbos aren't just things that just came up in the 20th or 21st century. These go a long, long, long way back. And what we're really doing is applying our modern reality to things that already were relevant a very, very long time ago. So we're not only looking at the bottom line, but we're looking at some of the discussions around getting to that bottom line and how they were applied a long time ago. So last week we discussed what constitutes cooking. That was this piece over here. We discussed that when it comes to cooking on Shabbat, there were like three things to keep in mind that come up a lot. One was this concept of merci kibishul, that something looks like cooking. That's something we're always concerned about doing. We don't want people, it's not a matter so much necessarily of like people are going to talk about us and say that we're cooking, but we don't do things on Shabbat that look like they're cooking. That's not in the spirit of Shabbat. We have this concept of shema yachateh, that concern that someone may stoke the coals, that sometimes we don't do things because they look like cooking. Sometimes we don't do things because we're afraid that we may actually come to cook. Like, let's say you left something on an open fire before Shabbat, which like maybe technically perhaps might not be cooking. If we're concerned that you're going to come and stoke the coals and lead to more cooking, that's a concern also. And the other thing that we talked about is we're always looking at whether something is cooked or not cooked. Like when we're allowing ourselves to do something on Shabbat, and we'll see that this like will come up, for example, with reheating things. If something's not cooked already, we're concerned that you're going to cook it. If something is, just checking if we have anyone else coming. If something is already cooked, we have we have a concept that once something's cooked, it doesn't get cooked more by recooking it. All that will be clear as we go on. So then we discussed, this is all just summary from last week, we discussed the concept of leaving food on the stove before Shabbat, or for that matter, in a crock pot before Shabbat, or on a blech before Shabbat. And I just wanted to go to the summary that we did. This was written up. This was like a summary that was written up on the Star K. And leaving food on Shabbat, leaving food before Shabbat is called shehiyah, which means like leaving it there. And we basically discussed how, here we go. I'll just read the summary. One is prohibited to, and this is on the screen if you're following along. One is prohibited to leave food on or in the place where it will be cooking, even if it was placed there before Shabbos. There's concern that leaving the food that is not ready to be eaten on the cooking surface may lead one to add heat on Shabbos. The rabbis were concerned that one may adjust the heat to enhance the food. In the past, when the cooking was done directly over burning logs, there was a concern that someone might stir the embers, which would add oxygen and generate heat. By stirring the embers, one transgresses 2 Torah prohibitions, burning a fire on Shabbos and cooking. In order to prevent any wrongdoing, the rabbis decree that unless the food is edible before Shabbos, one may not leave it on or in the oven when Shabbos begins, unless the embers are removed or covered to prevent someone from stirring them. In lieu of, and by the way, if you remember, we talked about that not only if it's cooked before that when we say that something's cooked before Shabbos, we could even be talking about it being a half cooked or a third cooked. And we also talked about the idea that if it was completely raw, that would be okay too, because there isn't a concern someone's going to adjust the flame, because adjusting the flame isn't going to have whatever is completely raw cooked in time. Basically, you're talking about it's on Shabbos already, so you're eating whatever it is in an hour or something like that. There's not a concern that adjusting the flame is going to have it be ready tonight if it's completely raw, right? It's going to be ready for tomorrow. And then we discussed that we don't cover the coals because that's not the kind of ovens that we have, but we have the custom of placing a blech over the flame on Shabbos. Therefore, with a modern oven cooktop, one should cover temperature controls and cover the flame with a blech. Okay, so that was all what we discussed last week. Okay, now someone's trying to get in. It's hard to share screen and let people in at the same time. Okay. So now for today, what we're going to talk about is called chazara. Chazara from the word lachzor, to return. Okay, here we go. So the particular piece that we're going to be looking at now is the concept of returning something. We talked last week about placing something on before Shabbat. Now we're talking about returning something to the flame on Shabbat, returning something to the blech or to the hot plate. This is specifically talking about where it's on Shabbat, you take it off and you want to put it back on. We are not talking about, which we will talk about next week, taking something like cold out of the fridge and putting it onto the blech or the hot plate. We're discussing now a case where you have something where this may come up very often, is with a crock pot, where let's say, I don't know, Shabbat morning, you want to take, you have someone's ready for lunch and you want to take some food out of the crock pot and then put the food back onto the crock pot to have more later on in the day, something along those lines. Or you leave, if you have like a cholent that you leave on a stove on a blech overnight and you want to take it off at some point in the middle of the night or in the morning or whatever, and then you want to put it back on. Okay, so that's the case. We're talking about chazara, meaning that you're taking something off flame and putting it back on, or off a blech or a hot plate or whatever the case, and putting it back on Shabbat. Again, we're not discussing now the case of taking something cold out of the fridge. That's what we're going to discuss next week. So we discussed 3 things, right, through this series. Last week was placing it on first before Shabbat and what can be done at that point. Now we're talking about when it's placed on, you're taking it off and putting it back on. And next week we'll talk about when you're taking it out of the fridge and it's cold. Okay, is that clear to everyone? Okay, great. So let's see what we're talking about. Okay, so chazar, returning food to the stove on Shabbat. You have it. I have it here. And by the way, just like last week, if you want the source sheet afterwards, I'm happy to send it. For those I sent the source sheet to last week, I sent all the sources that we're doing throughout the series, and we're also posting these on our website and also in your email. And the source sheets for each week are included in that, so you can get your hands on that. Here's our source sheet here. We're discussing from the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, written in the 1600s, and here written by Rav Yosef Cairo. I'm going to read in the Hebrew. For those following, you can see it on the screen. You have the English right next to it, and I'll refer to the English also in some of the cases. So, kirashi grufak tuma, so a stove that has been covered and raked, meaning we're talking about here, like for our purposes, a stove that has a blech on it, or for that matter, a hot plate, right? This is what we discussed last week, like a case, we're not talking about an open flame. So, v'natal k'dera me'aleha, and you take the pot off of it, afilu b'Shabbat, even on Shabbat, You're allowed to return it to the blech, to the hot plate, to the crock pot, as long as it is still, it says here, it's still boiling. Okay, so you take here could be an example that maybe would be very relevant. Let's say there's something that you're planning to eat Friday night and Shabbat day, some kind of like soup that you want to have. Maybe sometimes people have chicken soup Friday night and they keep it on for Shabbat day, right? So you want to be able to take, let's say, that soup out of the crock pot, off the crock pot or off the blech or off the hot plate, and take from it and then return it, right? As we'll see next week, you can't take a cold liquid and put it onto the blech or the hot plate if it's cold. But as long as this soup is still boiling, you can take it off and put it back on. However, there are stipulations to being allowed to do that. Here are the stipulations. First of all, the oda biyado. It has to still be literally here in your hand. We'll see what that means. Secondly, vilohi nicha agabi karka. You can't put it down on the floor. Now, we wouldn't be putting it down on the floor. We'd be putting it down on a countertop or a table or something like that. And then another, vidato lachzira. And you intend to put it back. You have in mind that you're putting it back. So what we're talking about here is that what you can't do is, what you really can't do is say, oh, we're having chicken soup tonight. Take the soup off, put it down on the counter, serve everybody. And now the soup is still hot. And you go, oh, you know what? We could put the soup back on and we'll have some soup tomorrow because I just found out that my, relative is coming and they really like chicken soup and they like it when it's been cooked all night. They love that deeply cooked chicken soup taste. So I'm going to put it back on now. So if you were standing there, you would say, no, you can't. Because you had to have in mind when you took it off that you were going to be putting it back on. And you had to be holding on to it with your hand. You can't put it down on the floor or on the counter. You put it down on the counter. You took your hands off of it. You had in mind, you didn't have in mind you were going to put it back. That doesn't work. You can't do that. Okay. Let's get back in here. There's a couple of more stipulations. This would be vidafka. Here we are in the English where it says Ramah. Over here. The food would have to be completely cooked. Then you can put it back. And he says, by the way, interestingly, you can even put it back to another stove. You could put it on a different stove. So according to this, right, like you could, let's say you took the soup off the blech and you go, oh, you know what, I want to put it on the hot plate. As long as you had all these, you had it in mind, you were going to put it back, you're holding on to it, you hadn't put it down, and it's still hot, you could do that, okay? But what's interesting is that, skipped over this. The Shulchan says, this is all talking about putting back onto a stove. But aval letocha asur, but to put it inside, into an oven, that's not allowed. And I put the note there that the Mishnah Berurah says that that's because it looks like cooking. Remember, we talked about that last week. The concern of the oven, right? You can't ever put something into the oven on Shabbos. Even if you have a Shabbos mode oven, even if the light's not going to go on, you can't put something into. You can take something out of, but you can't put it into. The reason you can't put it into is because it looks like cooking, as opposed to with the blech or the hot plate, where nobody thinks that you are cooking by putting onto the blech or onto the hot plate, because that's not the way that we cook. Okay, let's go on a little further. There's an interesting opinion that says, some say that the some say that this only applies where we're talking about taking something off the stove when it was still Friday and then wanting to put it back on once it's Shabbat. But if you took it off once it was already dark, you took it off Friday night, then none of these stipulations would apply. And he says you could be lenient like that, especially with our Tanarim Shalanu. But he says, Tov Lachmir, it's really better to be strict. Now, the reason I'm mentioning all of this is because what we'll see is that in extenuating circumstances, like let's go back to that case of taking the soup off the blech, and you weren't planning to put it back on, and then all of a sudden you realized, oh my gosh, the relative's coming and they really like, let's say that wasn't the case, but you realized, oh my gosh, I totally forgot that I need to put this back on because I don't have any food for tomorrow. In extenuating circumstances, it would be permissible to put it back on. So that's why it's important to mention this particular opinion here that says that some say all those stipulations are only if you took it off before Shabbat. Realize what that means. If you took it off before Shabbat, we're not really talking about returning to the flame. We're talking about putting it on the flame in the first place. So it's a different, so it's a little bit of a different scenario. Let me stop for a moment and see if there are any questions, just specifically on what I said here, because we're going to build on this a lot more. There's a lot more stipulations and things to consider. Linda, just unmute. No, okay.
Should I wait until you finish reading the whole thing?
Tell me the question, then we'll see.
So what happens if you want to serve the soup from on the blech? You don't take it off of the blech, the pot, but you want it to stay on all night.
So okay, I'm glad you asked now because we're not going to get specifically to this. You can't serve, let's say, soup off of the. You can't have soup on the blech and take soup out of the pot while the pot is on the blech. Similarly, you can't do that with a crock pot, and you can't do that with a hot plate. If you have cholent in a crock pot, you can't take food out of the crock pot. I'll tell you a cute story about this in a minute. You can't take food out of the crock pot while it's in the crock, right, out of the pot while it's on the element. You have to take it off the element in any of these cases. The reason for that is because if you don't take it off the element, then when you come to take soup or cholent or food or whatever out, it's like you're mixing it and you're doing more cooking right then and there. So you can't play around that. You have to take it off. That's exactly what we're talking about. Exactly what we're talking about is where you want to get stuff out, but you want to keep it on. So what do? So you have to, and we'll see more details on this, but basically you have to do all these things that we discussed, meaning you take it off, you hold on to it. You got to have like a hand on the pot. If you can't have your hand on the pot or there's someone else there, they can put their hand on the pot. The point is you're showing all along that I'm intending to put this back on. You have in mind that you're going to put it back on. You can put it down on a counter as long as you keep your hand on it and you take out, and then you can put it right back on when you finish. My cute story about this is that my parents are on, so they'll appreciate this. We were kids. I don't know. I must have been like, who knows, like 10 years old or something like that. And no, I kind of had to be a little bit older, I guess. We were babysitting. I was babysitting for someone on like Neighbors. This was the Adlers, by the way. I remember this very clearly. I think there must have been like a kiddush in shul or something, and they wanted to go to that kiddush. So we went home to like watch their kids, and we were supposed to have lunch with them. So they had cooked, and when they came home, they said, "Oh, you didn't take. You guys didn't have any cholent." So I said, we did. They said, what do you mean? I said, we took cholent. They said, but the crock pot's still on the thing. So, they thought that since like we grew up in a home that keeps Shabbat, like, of course we knew that like, if you want to take food out of the crock pot, you have to like take the crock pot off and have it in mind and then put it back on and the whole thing. But of course, we didn't know any of that. We didn't serve the food like our parents served the food. We didn't know how they did that or what they did. So I always remember that you could really take it off as long as you keep that all of that in mind. So that's what you would have to do. Okay, you would have to take it off, and we'll see this in the sources very shortly. You would have to take it off, have in mind you're putting it back on, keep your hand on it that you're going to put it back on. This is very, very relevant. This comes up a lot, especially this may come up for people if you have little kids who like maybe are going to eat at a different time than you're eating, and you want to serve them beforehand. So let's go back and see this borne out in the sources. Okay. So first of all, we said that this is as long as the food is still boiling. This is as long as the food is still boiling. So the Mishnah Berurah, who's the commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, says the following. He says that this idea of the food still being boiling is different than any of the other considerations here, that you have to have in mind that it's going back on, that you have to have your hand on it for a very specific reason. He says because all of those pieces are about showing that you intend to put it back on. We don't want it to look like you're cooking from the outset. But this idea of it still be boiling, he says, it's different than all the others. Their reasons are that the rabbis established that you need these considerations in order to be allowed to return to the flame. However, this concept of it still being boiling, the issue there is if it's not boiling any longer, if it's not hot any longer, then you run into a problem of cooking. So we will see when we talk about next week putting things on the flame on Shabbat, there's a significant difference, a major difference between things that are dry and things that are liquid. A liquid, to take a cold liquid and heat it up, there we actually have a concern of cooking. They are actually cooking, even if it was cooked previously. With the dry, we don't have that same concern. So it's an important piece to mention. This concept of having in mind that you're going to return it, and that you keep your hand on it, and that you don't put it down on the ground. Where does all that come from? So the Biur Halacha says the following. He says that the Ramah here, who's the Ashkenazi codifier of Jewish law, and he's the one who comments on this in the Shulchan Aruch, he says it's interesting that he takes mashmat the tafas the chumra be'abayot shaba'ul zeb Gemara, that when the Gemara discusses this, it lists a number of different possibilities basically, and the Ramah is being machmir, is being strict for all of them, meaning there was a thought that maybe what you had to do is have in mind that you're going to put it back on. There was another opinion that thought that maybe what you have to do is you have to hold on to it. There was another opinion that thought maybe what you have to do is not put it on the ground. He says the Ramah takes all of them, is strict with all of them. Then he says this is not like Udilo Behagat Maimoniot. This is not like another opinion that got Maimoniot, the Rambam's commentary, that says in the name of Sefer Truma, that one would be enough. Meaning, as long as you had in mind to put it back, even if you put it down, it's okay. Right? You don't have to have your hand on it. You just have to have in mind to put it back. And the reason that this is all relevant is here the following, this last piece. It could be that we could be lenient, since we're talking about rabbinic here. The only one that is possibly biblical, the only biblical prohibition is actually cooking it, if it was liquid. But this concept here of these stipulations, these are rabbinic stipulations. We don't really think that you're cooking this thing as long as it's still boiling hot and it's cooked. We don't have this concern that you're still cooking it. So therefore, he says we could possibly be lenient if you had the intention to put it back, but did not, but put it down and you're not holding on to it. Or if you're holding on to it, but you didn't have the intention to put it back, he says we can possibly be lenient if there's a need for that. So this is very important to know, because that really could come up quite often. Meaning it could quite often come up that, you forgot when you're taking it off that you want to put it back on, but you still happen to be holding the pot. Or you had in mind to put it back on, but you put it down. Right, so when there's a need for it, we can be lenient. And what do we mean by a need for it? We can be fairly liberal with what that means, a need for it. I have the intention of eating this tomorrow. It's going to add to my oneg Shabbat, right? It's going to add to my pleasure on Shabbat to be eating this, or this was part of what we were planning to eat, or whatever the case. Okay, that would be okay. Let me do a couple more pieces and then we'll stop again. The Mishnah Berurah makes another comment that we certainly, according to all opinions, we're only talking about garuf v'katum l'kulei alma beinan, that we're only talking about in a situation where the flame is covered, right? So that's like our crock pot, our hot plate, our blech. We're not talking about returning it to a flame that's on and uncovered on Shabbat. And finally, he says that this concept of if it is cooled down completely, that we're concerned about it actually being a biblical prohibition about cooking. So a few general principles, and I'll stop again and take some questions, and then we'll, with our remaining time, we'll look to summarize all this. A few general principles when it comes to taking something off the fire and putting it back onto the fire. First of all, it has to be something that's fully cooked. Now, that doesn't mean that, how do you define fully cooked by like chulent? Like, this is like ordering a burger. Like, is it medium? Is it medium well done? Or different people like different things. The point is, it has to be fully cooked. That basically anyone would eat it like this, right? Some people may want it even more cooked, right? But that has to be fully cooked. That people would consider this fully cooked. We wouldn't consider this to be raw. That you must have the intention to return, and that you can't put it down. You have to be holding on to it. Those are the keys to being allowed to return this to the fire. And we're going to see the summary below. Let me stop here. Questions or comments from anyone? You can raise your hand. Yeah, Linda, go ahead. You can if you have a question, you can put it into the chat if you want. Just have to unmute. Yeah.
So, right. So, okay. So I'm back to the soup again.
Mm-hmm.
If you have soup and you want to serve it the next day, if you do all the right things,
Mm-hmm.
and it goes back on the blech, even though it's not a direct flame, isn't it going to condense so much overnight that unless you had started out with so much extra liquid, which it wouldn't taste right that night, is like it wouldn't be right for the next day. It wouldn't taste right.
1 second. Is this a halachic question or a cooking question?
Well,
it's a cooking tips question. Then it's not for me.
No,
right?
it's halachic because can you add more? You can't add more water to it. Is that correct?
You can. Okay, so a couple of different things. First of all, it could be a situation. I mean, we have made soup in a crock pot and then left it on. So maybe on a low flame, or remember, you could be, if you have it on a blech, you could, like, people play around with that. They'll move it like a little bit off the fire. So it's just,
right.
It's just cooking a little bit. So it could be that kind of, that could happen. In terms of adding, you certainly can't add cold water to it. What you could do, did we discuss this last? I don't remember if we discussed this last week or I was just looking at it myself. What you could do is you could add boiling water to the pot, but you have to be very careful around that, because it would have to be added from another entity that's on a flame. So the easiest way to describe this is like, for someone, we actually could do this in our house. If you have a crock pot and you have a water urn and they're right next to each other, you could add water directly from the urn into the crock pot, but you can't like put it in a cup, in a mug, and pour that into the crock pot. The reason is you can switch water. You could switch anything from one flame to another, right? So but it has to be on the flame. So you actually couldn't even, let's say you had a kettle on the blech also, you couldn't pick up the kettle and pour it into the pot, because now you've lifted it off. So unless you have like a water urn, if you have an urn right nearby and you're able to safely get the water from the urn directly into the pot, you could do that. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to add water to it. But you could have a situation, another example of this could be like if it was something that you sort of like slow cooked throughout the day and we're planning to continue to slow cook it overnight. So it could be like a cholent. You could have put a cholent up like Friday morning and plan to eat it Friday night, and it's like, it's cooked, it's definitely fully cooked, but it really could use a whole overnight of cooking, and you'll leave it on the blech or on the hot plate or on the crock pot overnight till the next day. That could be a situation also that you would work for. Okay, any other questions from anyone, or for that you want to share now or put into the chat? Okay, so let's see this summarized, and then if we have time, we'll look at one other neat piece about this. So here's a summary. Again, this comes from the same place. It's really summarized very nicely in an article by Star K, and I have the link on here. So if you have the source sheet, you can go to the website. Another rabbinic prohibition is chazara, returning food to the heat source on Shabbos. Even if the food is still hot and fully cooked, one may not return it to an oven or a covered stove. Sorry. One may not return it. I don't know why we even have a house phone. We never answer anything from it. It just rings at inconvenient times. Even if the food is still hot and fully cooked, one may not return it to an oven or a covered stove unless it was removed with the intention of being replaced. It may not leave his hand from the time it was removed to the time it was replaced on the heat. This certainly would prohibit taking a cold, pre-cooked food and placing it on a blech on Shabbos. Now, that last case, we're going to look at how you do that next week. This rabbinic decree was instituted because by placing food on the heat, it appears as if one is beginning to cook. All right, so therefore, right, being very intentional and clear that when I took it off, I haven't interrupted that process. I'm not beginning to cook. I'm continuing the cooking. That's the point. It's important to note that reheating cooked foods that are liquid or contain liquid may be a transgression of the Torah's prohibition against cooking on Shabbos. Solid foods that have been fully cooked before Shabbos may be reheated, kugel or roast, for example, on Shabbos. However, due to the prohibition of chazar, reheating must be done in a way that cannot be confused with cooking. Therefore, one may place a kugel or challah on top of a pot of food as on the blech, but not on top of the blech itself. We're going to look at more cases directly relevant to that, of taking something cold and placing it to heat. We're going to look at that next week. Okay, so this is basically the issues of chazara. I'm going to pause here for a moment and ask if there's any questions or comments. And if not, then we're going to look at a little bit of information about the Shabbos mode oven, because it relates to some of this and some of what we discussed last week. Okay, so.
So this is Marion.
Yes, go ahead. You know we can't see you, right?
Yeah, that's because there's other motion going on in the background.
No problem.
So a corollary to Linda's question is, I guess the answer is the fact that something liquid like a soup would concentrate by virtue of staying on heat overnight. That is not an issue as long as you don't stir it or add to it.
Correct, right? Absolutely correct. And that really goes back to last week. Meaning, it sounds like what you're talking about is you're not necessarily concerned about taking it off, putting it back on, but it sounds like what you're saying is basically you're cooking on Shabbos. How could you do that? Is that the question?
Right. I mean, it's intrinsic in its staying on the heat is that it is going to concentrate, right, which presumably is a form of.
Okay, good. So, right. So then we go back to last week's class. And what we looked at last week was, right, remember, if you have something that's completely raw, we're not really concerned about cooking on Shabbos if you set it up beforehand. We're only concerned about, the only case that we're concerned about if you set it up beforehand is if you may come to do something to hasten the cooking. So if you had the food that was completely raw, remember, we discussed that. We discussed the case where if you could take a completely raw cholent and put it up right before Shabbos. What do you think is going to happen? Of course it's going to cook. That's the whole point. If it doesn't cook, it's not really going to work, right? So you can. The reason it had to be raw was we were worried about you adjusting the temperature. And we say when something is completely raw, you're not going to adjust the temperature because bottom line is this isn't going to be ready for tonight. It's going to be ready for tomorrow. You'll leave it alone. That was also the concept of covering the blech and adjusting the flame. I guess to be more correct, when we say we're concerned it looks like you're cooking, what we really mean is we're concerned it looks like you are cooking, not that it looks like there's cooking that's happening. Of course there's cooking that's happening. At any time you're making a cholent, you're leaving it on over the whole thing, right? So the point about the soup is, yeah, it's fine. That can concentrate. It can cook up more. There's no problem with that as long as you set that up before Shabbos. The only concerns would be if it wasn't cooked. And when we say it wasn't cooked before Shabbos, we mean at least a half or maybe a third, or it wasn't completely raw, right? And then the only concern with those is that we're concerned that you're going to adjust something. So the point is, cooking can happen on Shabbos, but you can't actively be involved in the cooking process on Shabbos. And that's what we want to make sure that we're staying away from.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. Good clarification. Okay, so let's see. I want to pull up this article. I pulled it up before, but I don't see it. It's here. Hold on a sec. Here we go. So here are 10 myths about Starkey Shabbat mode ovens. Some of them are more relevant and some are less relevant, okay? So first of all, this is an important one, but it's not, the Starkey cares about this. I don't really care about this so much, right? Every oven that has a Shabbos mode is certified by the Starkey. That's the myth. The fact is that that's not necessarily the case. That it might be certified by Starkey, it might not be certified by Starkey. They had a significant role in this, but others have taken that title. That's fine. Okay, now, a person who does not intend to raise or lower the oven temperature this is the myth. I should clarify that for people who aren't reading along with me. This is the myth. A person, just one second, I want to make sure I'm not going to run out of battery. Okay. A person who does not intend to raise or lower the oven temperature may use any oven on Shabbos and Yom Tov, and there is no reason to use an oven which has a Starkey Shabbat mode. So the fact is, when using an oven on Shabbos or Yom Tov, it may be necessary to put into a Starkey Shabbat mode, even if the temperature will not be adjusted. The reason for this is that, and we discussed this last week, is that even if the temperature will not be adjusted, an oven needs to be put into Starkey Shabbos mode in order to disable a 12-hour automatic shut-off and to prevent any lights or icons from going on or off. That's important, right? No matter what we're talking about, just like in your refrigerator, you can't have it set up so that the light goes on when you when you open the door. So too on an oven, you can't be set up so the light goes on. So that might be a reason, right? What we're talking about here is, let's say you don't have a Shabbat mode oven and you put it on warm and you leave it on for the whole Shabbos, right? So you say to yourself, I'm not going to adjust the temperature. That should be okay. So the answer is, no, it's not okay, because there might be a light issue. And also there's this automatic shut off. So you got to be aware of that. When another myth, when an oven is in the Starkey Shabbat mode, it may be used on Shabbos in the same way that it is used every other day of the week. That is not true. Fact is, when an oven is in Starkey Shabbat mode, the oven temperature may neither be adjusted nor turned on or off on Shabbos. Putting it on into Starkey Shabbat mode does not permit these things to be done. And I think that's a pretty common myth, that people think you can adjust it. You can't do that. You can do that maybe on Yom Tov, but not on Shabbat. The reason for this is that the thermostatic controls are not disabled by putting the oven into Starkey Shabbat mode. Therefore, changing the oven temperature will affect the flame going on and off. Even if these don't have an immediate change, that is a problem. When an oven, I'm going to skip over this now. It has to do with Yom Tov. It'll be a little bit confusing, and just for time's sake, we're going to skip that. When an oven, myth number 5, oven is in Starkey mode during Shabbos, the oven door may be opened in order to remove some food, then closed and subsequently opened once again in order to remove more food. We discussed this last week. You can't do that. The reason is, when the oven door is open, the thermostat will register the change in temperature and cause the flame to go on sooner than usual. Causing the flame to go on is problematic. However, if all the food is removed and it's now empty, that would be okay. The other case that would be okay would be if you shut your oven off. If the oven is completely off, then you could take some food out and close the door, and then take some food out later on. That's also not a problem. When an oven is in Starkei Shabbat mode, cold, fully cooked food may be put into the oven on Shabbos. We know the answer is no, you cannot do this. We discussed this last week and also today. For the same reason, no additional food can be placed. Here. As mentioned above, when an oven is in Starkei mode, the door is open on Shabbos. All the food in the oven must be removed. Additionally, if the food had not previously been on the fire on Shabbos, they forbid put fully cooked food onto the fire on Shabbos. And also another reason I would add, which they don't have here, is that putting into the oven is problematic anyways because it looks like cooking regardless. Any other ones I want to cover? One sec. Yeah, that's it. I think those are the relevant ones for our purposes. And we're almost out of time. So let me stop here for a moment and see if anyone has any questions or comments. You can put them in the chat or unmute and speak up. Okay, great. So just to wrap up, last week we discussed, and the time goes by really quickly, and it doesn't feel like we ever, there's so much more to do. What we're looking at in this class is very specifically 3 very specific, minute cases of food preparation on Shabbat. The ones that have to do mostly with heating and reheating food. So last week we talked about putting food on before Shabbat. This week we talked about taking food off the flame and putting it back on, or the blech, or the hot plate. And next week we're going to talk about taking cold food out of the fridge and putting it on. There are, needless to say, but there are so many other issues, of course, that we could be discussing. We're just not. There are issues relating to cooking that have to do with, like making coffee or tea or something like that. There could be issues having to do with food preparation, having to do with cutting or peeling food. I mean, there's lots of other issues. And of course, then there's lots of issues on Shabbat that have nothing to do with food preparation at all. But we're discussing these 3 specific cases because I think that they're particularly relevant and come up a lot when it comes to food preparation. So next week we'll discuss the one that maybe is most interesting. I don't know. I guess it depends on what kind of food you like to eat. But the case of like on Shabbat morning, taking your cold food out of the fridge and heating it up. How can you do that? We've already covered some of that in the midst of all this because there's a lot of overlap, but we'll discuss that more fully next week. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of the day. If you're not signed up for Saturday night this Motzei Shabbat, we've got a very, very special Havdalah, followed by singing and Malava Malka with Shlomo Katz. He's a world-renowned Jewish musician. He's a very, very inspiring guy. I'm a big fan of his. And he's going to be joining us to lead Havdalah and then to share songs and words of Torah. Just really very, very inspiring. And by the way, the week after, we have another great Saturday night program with Shalva. Shalva is an incredible organization with a very, very inspiring story too. Also, that has to do with music, actually. I encourage you to see your emails. If you haven't seen it yet, it's in your email, it's on our website, and it'll be advertised more in the coming days as well. So I hope you'll register and join us for both of those. Be well, everyone. Have a great day and a good Shabbos.
Thank you. Good Shabbos.